Well, good morning. It's good to see you. My name is Luke. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm part of our preaching team. And before we dive into that passage, I just want to take a moment and celebrate together something that just is an evidence of your generosity and God's grace to us through our church. Last Christmas, we did our Christmas offering. We do that pretty much every year. We pick a few different causes that we want to contribute to and just give a one-time gift to it. And you all give really generously to that year after year, and you did last year. And one of the projects was related to our partners in Juarez, Mexico, where Missions Ministry is our partner. They're like a hub resource center for a number of churches in one of the poorest parts of Juarez. And so Missions Ministry does a lot of really cool ministries. We send teams down there to build homes, and we've been sending staff teams to go meet with the pastors and their wives and just doing some cool stuff. And one of the things we've been able to get behind is this new youth ministry they started a year or two ago, where kids from all the surrounding neighborhoods and kids from those various churches all come to Missions Ministries for youth group. And so we had a chance to go, my family and I did last year, and got to see it, and it was like, wow. But the thing was, it was just bursting at the seams, and so they needed to expand it. And so part of what we used our Christmas offering for was to give them the resources to be able to expand that room. And so I just wanted to celebrate that together. They sent us some pictures from the group. You can see that black area is where it's cut out. That was the expansion. And really the room used to stop where that white tile stops. And so that's where it used to be. And so now there's like rows, more and more rows of people, and just an opportunity for them to still have a band and really make it a pretty cool environment. And so I just want to thank you for your generosity and celebrate God's grace through it. So congratulations, way to go. We love our students here. We love the students there, and it's pretty special. So we are starting this new series today, the 5 Gs, and I love this quote by A.W. Tozer. He says, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." Now, anytime we say, hey, this is the most important thing about something, like that's whatever you claim, that's a big claim, right? So he says what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Now, that only makes sense if God really did make the world, if this really is God's world, and if someday we're going to have to give an account to God for how we lived in his world, which is true. That's what the Bible teaches. So I think Tozer's right when he says what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. So what comes into your mind when you think about God? See, some people are like, I don't believe in God at all. But most people are like, I believe in God. But then you have to kind of go, well, which one? Which version? And we all kind of like our different, even people that have kind of more of a Christian influence, like even there's still like well, which version? Like if you ever saw, some of you, I know some of you are as unholy as I am, and you saw Talladega Nights years ago, that comedy movie with Will Ferrell, where he plays Ricky Bobby, and they're at the dinner table, and he keeps praying to the 8-pound, 6-ounce baby Jesus, and his father-in-law gets mad at him, and he's like, listen, I pay the bills here, and I like the baby version the best, right? That's how I say grace, right? And we all kind of have our different versions of God. And so I made a list of different versions of God that people have today. Some people have the Sedona version of God, right? The Sedona version of God is very spiritual and chill, and he's feeling the good vibes. That's the Sedona version. There's the Siri version, or the Alexa version, and that's who you call out to when you need help, right? You kind of ignore this version of God the rest of the time, but sometimes it's like, hey, Siri, I need help. Hey, Alexa, I need help. So that's the Siri version. There's also the stained glass version of God. Some of you grew up with the stained glass version of God. The stained glass version of God, he only lives at church, and he only cares what you do on Sundays. The rest of the week, hey, it's up to you. Just don't run in church. That's the main thing. Then there's the hashtag blessed version of God. The hashtag blessed version of God, you can find him on Instagram because he is all over the place there, keeping people happy and rich and healthy and great looking. That's the hashtag blessed version. There's the Santa version of God. The Santa version, I'm not sure why we love Santa, because listen to Santa. Santa he's making a list. He's checking it twice. He's going to find out who's naughty and nice. Santa Claus is coming to town. That sounds pretty scary, actually, but some people, that's how they think. Like, there's the Grandpa Biden edition, Grandpa Biden version of God. He's technically still in charge, but things are moving slow. We're not really sure he's there, but we like when he gives us money. Right? That's how a lot of people think about God. There's the BFF version of God. God is your best friend forever. He'll never look down on you. He'll never make you feel bad. He'll never contradict you. He'll just always cheer for you. You go you. The BFF version of God. There's the woke version of God. He or she loves everybody, especially those who are victims of microaggressions. And this version of God will never make you feel bad for your sexual preferences, whatever you want. There's the MAGA version of God, who thinks Jesus was fine, but he was a little soft. And if he'd have just hit back on his enemies a little harder, he could have really made Jerusalem great again. And then there's the safe space version of God. And this God would never make a list like I just made and permanently and try to offend everybody in the room. Okay, so that was my goal, just have a little fun, try to kind of pick on all of you. You know, if you throw a rock into a pack of dogs, the one that barks is the one that got hit. So if you're too offended by that, like, it's a you problem. We're just having fun here. But it makes a pretty significant point, which is that someone has said it this way, that God made man in his image, and man has been returning the favor ever since. And listen, we don't want a version of God, we want God. And if we want to know who God is, we have to look at his word. So what this series is going to be is a theology series. We do different kinds of sermon series. We do text series where we're working through a book like we did most of this year with Genesis. We do topic series where we're looking at a topic like relationships. That was like the Lies About Love series we just did. This is a theology series. We'll go back to text after this. But this theology series, theology is the study of God. What is God like? Who is he? What is he like? And here's what's really important. If you want to know what God's like, the best place to look is Jesus. What is God like? He's like Jesus, because Jesus is God. And so there's lots of passages we could study, but for this series, we've just decided to really focus in on Jesus. We're going to look at stories and passages from the Gospel of Luke. So this is a study of God from the Gospel of Luke, and this has massive implications for our lives. This kind of a series has the opportunity for us to really grow spiritually in our faith. Now, sometimes people talk about spiritual growth. I want to pursue spiritual growth, or I don't feel like I'm growing spiritually. Here's the simple way that I think about spiritual growth. Spiritual growth is there's what we say we believe, and there's how we live. Spiritual growth is closing the gap. It's closing the gap between what you say you believe, that's your confessional faith, what you confess to be true, and then your functional faith, which is how you actually live. Spiritual growth is the process of closing that gap. And I think this series has massive power for you to close that gap, for what you say about God, what we say to be true, to actually begin to shape the way you live. So we're going to look at how God is glorious, and how God is generous, and how God is great, and how God is good, and how God is gracious. And for each of those, we're going to see what that massive big truth means for our actual lives. And the reality is every sin flows from somehow ignoring or minimizing the truth about God, right? Like a lot of us deal with anger. Sometimes it's above the surface. We're just kind of obviously angry people. Other people is like it's seething and it's quiet, but occasionally it bursts out, right? Why are we so angry? Why are you angry? Here's why. Because you're struggling to trust that God is really in control and that he's good. And so you try to think you're in control, but then something happens that shows you you're not in control, but you don't trust that God is, and so you get angry. Why do you lie? Here's why you lie. A lot of the time is because what you think people are going to think of you if you tell the truth, that matters more than what's actually true. It matters more than what God says is right. So you fudge it, you twist it, you hold it back, you do something because people's opinion of you matters more than God's opinion of you. Why do you overwork? Some of us really deal with overworking. We struggle to rest. We struggle to Sabbath. Why? Because deep in us, even though we say that God is enough for me, we really actually function as though life only has meaning if I can prove myself. So listen, at the root of all of our struggles with sin is actually a theology problem. And so that's what we're going to address in this series. I was telling a friend of mine about these truths a few months ago, and he texted me a few days later, and he's like, man, I love these 5 Gs. He goes, these really have the power to change my life. I can't stop thinking about them. And that was actually one of the things that made me go, you know what, we need to talk about this because we want theology that meets us where we're really at. All right, so here's the big idea of today's message from Luke chapter 12. The big idea today is this: God is glorious, so I don't have to fear others. God is glorious, so I don't have to fear others. Now, when we think of glory, a lot of times glory has to do with the idea of majesty or magnificence or brightness. But one of the key ideas as it relates in the Bible to glory is weightiness. When the glory of God comes to earth, the earth quakes because God is weighty. God is heavy. God is significant. And so what this is really about is, where do we put what's most significant? And here's what we're going to see. God is glorious, so we don't have to fear others. So here's where we're headed with that, is we're going to look at the fear of man. We're going to look at the man to fear, and then we're going to look at the freedom of fearing God. Pray with me. Father, we don't want to just map our own version of you onto our hearts. We want to actually sit under who you say you are in your word. So God, help us to do that. Help us to see Jesus, to be changed by your glory, so that the fear of man that we struggle with would go down. We pray it in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so the first thing we want to see in Luke chapter 12 is the fear of man, the fear of man. And so if you have your Bible, look at it with me. This is here in chapter 12, verse 1. Back in chapter 11, Jesus, just before this, has been talking about persecution and people who come against you because of your faith, just like they came against the prophets. And it says there's this huge crowd gathered, so many that they're almost trampling on each other. And Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and here's what he says. He says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. So let's just make sure we understand what he's talking about here. Leaven is the idea of yeast. A leavener is something you would put in anything you're trying to bake. Leavener or yeast, what it does is just a little bit of it makes it where the dough will rise and the dough will expand, right? When we have communion, we have matzah, which is unleavened bread, which is why that is technically bread, but it actually feels more like a cracker, because it doesn't have yeast. It hasn't become like what we normally think of with bread. So leavener, and you don't need a lot of it, and a little bit goes a long way. And so what Jesus is saying, he's saying there's this yeast in the lives and in the teaching of the Pharisees. So what are Pharisees? Pharisees were this group of ultra-religious people who, like, everyone in Israel thought, these are the most faithful guys. These are the ones who have set themselves apart. Most people probably aren't going to heaven, but if anyone goes to heaven, it's a Pharisee. That's how they thought. And Jesus says, actually, watch out for them. Because there's this little thing at work that if you're not careful, it's going to actually fill up your life. You will accidentally become a Pharisee. One of my friends says that becoming a Pharisee is like eating dinner at Denny's. Nobody means to, you just end up there. You just drift into it. Well, how do you drift into it? What do we watch out for? Here's what he says. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. Now, I talk about this a lot because Jesus talked about it a lot and because we misunderstand it a lot. Hypocrisy, we think hypocrisy is somebody says one thing and does another. That's not how Jesus sees it. Jesus describes hypocrisy as not just saying one thing and doing another, but saying one thing, doing another, and pretending you aren't doing another. It's all about pretending. It's all about the show you're putting on. So here's a definition of hypocrisy, this Greek word. What it means is insincerity by virtue of pretending to have qualities or beliefs that you do not really have. Play acting, pretense, outward show. So get this. Jesus says, here's the problem with the Pharisees. It's not that they don't do what they say. It's that they pretend they actually do when they don't. It's all a show. So Jesus gives some examples of this elsewhere in Matthew chapter 6. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying, hey, here's something to watch out for, is don't pray like the hypocrites do. Because the hypocrites, they like to get out on the street corner and make a big deal, make a big show of their prayer. He says this is what the Pharisees do. They just try to impress you with their verbiosity and their prayer. And he says, no, get in a closet, pray by yourself, and your Father will see you. And then he brings up an example of fasting. And he says, here's what they do, is they disfigure their faces, right? They make themselves look like they're in anguish when they're fasting. Why? So that someone will come up and go, hey, what's going on? You don't look good. Are you okay? And you can go, yes, I'm just fasting. And it's very difficult to serve the Lord like this. And the people will think, wow, you're so holy. And you'll say, yes, that's true, I am. And so Jesus says, no, don't do that. Take a shower, put some lotion on your face, do your hair, make it look like you're fine. The Lord will see you. You don't have to put on a show for other people. He talks about giving. Some people, like these Pharisees, they like to give in order to be seen so that buildings can be named after them. No. Go give in private. God who sees you in private will do it. Right? But what it's all about is the show. That's why Jesus, in all three examples, what he says is they'll get their reward in full. They'll get what they want, which is people to be impressed. But God won't be impressed. And so Jesus says, watch out for this. Now, where does this play acting, this hypocrisy, where does it come from? Where it comes from is the fear of man. Here's what fear of man is. Fear of man is craving the acceptance and approval of other people. It's not just noticing what other people think, but it's craving, it's needing. It's being dependent on what they think of me. Do they like me? What do they think of what I said? Well, what's their opinion, right? We have other terms for this. The other terms you could use for this would be people pleasing. Right? If you go, I'm such a people pleaser. Okay, use the biblical term and say, I'm such a fear of man. Or you could say peer pressure. It's all about fear of man. Or codependency or insecurity. These are all fear of man issues. What do people really think of me? I'm enslaved to how I'm coming across. That's what it is. And this is it's a miserable way to live. It's like living in a hall of funhouse mirrors. You ever go to the carnival or fair or something, and there's this little room, there's all these mirrors, and some of them are wavy and they're angled in different ways. And so in one of them you look really short and really wide, and another one you look like you're 10 feet tall, and you kind of go back and forth between them, and it's kind of fun. But that's what living with the fear of man is, right? Because one person says, well, you're this. Another person says, no, you're that. And it's like, well, who am I? It's disorienting. It's a hall of funhouse mirrors. Now, I'm preaching this sermon as someone who struggles with the fear of man. And so this is why God is glorious, so I don't have to fear others. This is and has been, and I pray will continue to change my life. And I want it to change yours too. But it's only going to change it if you realize, yeah, I actually do struggle with this. So let's get some diagnostic questions. These are from Ed Welch. He has a book called When People Are Big and God is Small, which just by itself, isn't that a great title? When people are big and God is small, right? It's all about fear of man. So diagnostic questions. Are you easily influenced? Are you afraid of being exposed as an imposter? Are you thinking, what if they really knew? What if people found out? Are you often second-guessing decisions because of what others might think, right? You know what's right. You know what the Bible says. You know what your convictions are. You know what the best thing, but but how's it going to be perceived? Do you turn your relational wants into needs? Because we all have wants in relationships. But now it's like I need you to feel this way about me. I need you to think of me this way. You've crossed into fear of man. Do you easily get embarrassed? Do you ever lie or exaggerate? Right? Make things sound a little worse than they were to evoke a little more sympathy. Or make things sound way cooler than they were to make people be way more impressed with you. It's hypocrisy. It's fear of man. Do you ever lie or exaggerate? Do other people often make you angry or depressed? Your emotional well-being is just tethered to what people think of you, and you're just riding the roller coaster emotionally because of it. Or this one, I think this is really insightful. Are you determined to be known as an independent person? Which, just think about that one for a minute. Like, what's really important is I need people to know that I don't care what they think of me. It's very important to me that people think of me in a way that shows I don't care what they think of me. Like, that's, like you're, right? That's fear of man. And so what the world says to this, because the world goes, yeah. I mean, the world doesn't talk in fear of man terms, but they'd say, hey, codependency is a problem, over kind of peer pressure, that's a problem, this insecurity is a problem. So the world comes with an answer, and the answer is basically, well, you just need to feel better about yourself. The world's answer is you need more self-esteem. The problem with that, where that becomes kind of hollow, is it makes you dependent then on whoever or whatever is going to boost your self-esteem. And it's still fragile. You don't need self-esteem. The Bible comes in and says, no. You don't need self-esteem. You need God-esteem. You need to think of God more than you think about yourself. You don't need to focus on yourself. You need to think about him. Proverbs 29, verse 25 says, the fear of man lays a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. It's a snare, it's a trap, because the people who love Jesus in this moment, right? Verse 1, people are gathered together, thousands of them, they're trampling. Oh man, we can't wait to hear what he has to say. In not very many chapters, these are going to be the same people who shout, crucify him. The crowd is fickle. That's the fear of man. It leads us to the second part of this text where we see the man to fear. The man to fear. So jump down to verse 4. And Jesus says this, and even this is like an arresting thing to notice. Jesus says, verse 4, I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have nothing more they can do. Which just stop for a second. Like, this just shows us how different Jesus' perspective is from ours. Like, here's what Jesus saying. Hey, don't fear people who the worst they can do is kill you. You're like, what? Like, I can't imagine anything worse than that. Jesus can. Jesus can imagine something worse, right? Because Jesus is coming at this from an eternal perspective. We're thinking in a materialistic way. We're thinking in a here and now way, right? We're thinking about this little dot of time that is our life. Jesus is thinking about the whole line of eternity that comes out of that dot. And Jesus' perspective here, it's just wildly different, right? He says, don't fear people who the worst they can do is kill you. Because listen, if you're trusting in me, Jesus says, and they kill you, you're in the presence of God. That sounds fine. Don't fear them. Don't live in reverence of them. Don't live to honor them. Don't live to trust and obey them. Don't do that. Don't fear them. What does Jesus say instead? He goes, there's only so much they can do. So in verse 5, instead, he says, but I will warn you whom to fear. There is someone you should fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Jesus says, hey, man can only do so much, but there is someone that you're going to have to give an account to. Every single person. Fear him who, after he's killed, has authority to cast into hell. Fear the one who's not in charge of just the little dot, but who's in charge of the whole line of eternity. Well, who is that? Well, Jesus, it's Jesus. We're told in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. So everyone is going to stand before Jesus. Jesus is this person. Jesus is the one who has authority over heaven and hell. Jesus is the one that we will stand before. And all the evidence will be laid out. Go back to verse 2 and verse 3. Right, Jesus is talking about the Pharisees and how, part of their game is they think, well, no one will know. He says, not so fast. Look at verse 2. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, what you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and what you've whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops. A lot of times it happens in court cases. You see this in real life. You see this on TV, where it's like there's some evidence that's very damning against the accused. Right? If the jury saw it, it'd be like, this is open and shut, super easy evidence here. But it will sometimes not be admissible in court because of how it was handled or mishandled or different technicalities of the law, right? And so they'll have to argue the case, but they can't actually bring in all the evidence. Jesus goes, hey, listen, when you stand before the judgment seat of Christ, all the evidence is admissible in this court. Fear that judge. Don't fear the people who can judge you at school and in your industry and in your neighborhood and on your kid's football team. Don't give your respect and your honor and your submission to them. No. Give it to the one who controls eternity. Fear him. What does it mean to fear God? I've been hinting at this, but I like Tim Chester's definition. He has a book called You Can Change, and this is where I got the idea of these G's that we're talking about in this series. And in that book, he says, to fear God is to respect, worship, trust, and submit to him. It's the proper response to his glory, holiness, power, wrath, love, and goodness. In other words, it's a proper response to his weightiness. And so Chester there, he talks about his glory. Well, the glory of Jesus, we see the glory of Jesus if you read the Gospel of Luke. If you read the Gospel of Luke, you'll see this scene where Jesus goes up on the mountain and a few of his closest disciples, they come up and Elijah is there and Moses is there and Jesus is transfigured where his glory, his divinity just shines through in such a way that it like lights up the whole mountain. Peter falls on his face and is like, can we just stay here forever? This is the best. But Jesus isn't just glorious in his transfiguration. He ends up glorious in his resurrection. Because after he dies in place of sinners, he's buried and then he's raised from the dead with a new body that will never be destroyed. That's glory. That's weightiness. That's going to last forever. So to fear him is to respect and worship and trust and submit to him in light of that glory. But he's also holy. Over and over, Jesus encounters people and they're dirty and they're unclean and they're morally stained. And rather than him catching their sin, rather than him catching their disease, they catch his cleanness. He's holy. He's also powerful. Earlier in the Gospel of Luke, there's this long section that shows that Jesus has authority over nature and over demons and over disease and over death. Boom, boom, boom. Boom. Nothing can stop the power of Jesus. And you see the wrath of Jesus. This isn't the part we think about much. But listen, if you really love something, you get legitimately and righteously angry when what you love is being destroyed by evil. And so when Jesus goes into the temple and he sees people that have turned the temple, which is supposed to be a house of prayer, into a house of business that takes advantage of especially the poorest people by saying, hey, that sacrifice you brought, yeah, that one's not good enough. Why don't you buy one of our pre-approved ones? And Jesus decides, I'm not going to have that. And he shows his wrath when he makes a whip of cords and he turns over the tables and he knocks them out of the temple. So when we think of glory, that's what we think of. We think of God's glory and holiness and power and wrath. But what about what Chester also says, his love and goodness? Well, that's why I'm so glad this text doesn't end in verse 5. Because if all you had was verse 5, then Jesus would only be a threat. But let's keep reading. Look at verse 6. Jesus continues, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? And not one of them is forgotten before God. Why, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you're of more value than many sparrows. Jesus is saying, hey, you know those sparrows that are just kind of running around all the time? You're just trying not to hit them with your car? Like, almost all the time they just get out of the way. You know why? Because God is looking after them. And when they do fall, he's aware of it. He knows it. And he's going, if that's how God feels about these birds, imagine how he feels about you. You're made in his image. You're made in his likeness. Human being, pinnacle of God's creation. If that's how God, he's going, even the hairs of your head are numbered. And you go, well, who cares how many hairs I have? Exactly. Nobody. Unless you don't have very many, then you care. But who cares? I'm not my hair. Exactly. And if Jesus knows how many hairs are on your head, how much more does he care about what actually matters? And so it's an amazing thing in the middle of verse 7, why even the hairs of your head are numbered. Fear not. Wait, what? Which is it? You said, don't fear those who can only kill me. Fear the one who can send me to hell. Yeah, make sure you fear him. But don't be afraid. Why? Because of his love and his goodness. Jesus, do you know what his name means? His name means God saves. So when we say Jesus is Lord, yes, Jesus is Lord, and you will answer to him in eternity. But God saves is Lord. And so Jesus' power and glory is not just displayed when he's casting out demons and when he's raising the dead. Jesus' power and glory is also displayed when he puts on a towel and he gets down on his knees and he washes the disciples' feet, even Judas Iscariot who would betray him. And Jesus' glory is seen in his goodness, where on the cross he's suffering a death he does not deserve. And he still cries out, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. And it's in that moment when Jesus gives up his breath that the Roman soldier sees the glory of Jesus and says, surely this man was the Son of God. Because God's glory is not just seen in his acts of might and power, but in his valiant acts of sacrifice. Jesus is weighty. Jesus is glorious. Jesus is gracious to us. John 3:17 says, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. So we've looked at the fear of man and the man to fear. Now, finally, let's just consider for a few moments the freedom of fearing God. How does Jesus' glory, okay, Jesus is weighty over eternity. Jesus is glorious in all of his different ways that is manifest. How does Jesus being glorious help me not be such a slave to what other people think of me? Here's how. If somebody this glorious approves of you, who cares who doesn't? It's a question of perspective. Right? This is Jesus. Jesus, the light of the world. Jesus, God saves, our salvation. Well, look at what it says in Psalm chapter 27, verse 1. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? I am cloaked, covered, wrapped in total security. Like I could not be more loved and more known and more seen and more delighted in by God himself. And if that's how God feels about me, of whom shall I be afraid? So I'm sure there are people you can think of in your life, like, man, you'd like to impress them. You'd like them to think well of you. I just want you to picture them right now in your head. And then picture Jesus in all of his glory standing next to them. Doesn't the camera lens of your mind's eye kind of focus in on Jesus? And the other person just gets a little blurrier. Yeah. Now listen, fearing God, fearing Jesus, respecting him, loving him, worshiping him, fearing him this way, does not mean you'll never care what people think. The Bible actually says that your reputation's a good thing and you should care about it. And so there's something to be said there. So fearing God doesn't mean you won't care what people think. Fearing God doesn't mean you'll never have an anxious response. Someone will say something and it's uncomfortable and you have to deal with the visceral experiences in your body of anxiety and of fear and of embarrassment or what. It doesn't mean you'll never have that. It doesn't mean if you ever have that, boy, you don't trust God. Here's another thing fearing God doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that now you'll become a cold and calloused person. Right? That is a lot of the way people do it. They go, you know what, I care too much about what people think of me, so I'm going to just stop caring about people. That'll fix it. And you know what? That will fix it. It will. You just become hard-hearted, cold, cruel, and you will age like a raisin, shriveling up. But that's not the life you want. You want to age like fine wine. You want to age with generosity and with grace and the goodness and the kindness of God coming out of you. Isn't that what you want? And so I just want to tell you, this truth is what gives you that. Right? The way we say it here, the vision we cast for it, is that we are trying to cultivate and be people who have soft hearts and steel spines. Soft hearts. So seeing that God is glorious, so I don't have to fear others, that gives me a soft heart. Because think about it, if I have to impress people, then I really can't love people. I just am using them. Even my acts of love are just using them to get what I really want, which is for them to feel good about me. So even love at that point is selfish. But if now I already have all that I need from God, I can now actually serve them instead of use them, and I can have a soft heart. This truth also gives you a steel spine, because you're going to have people speak against you, and you're going to have people attack you. And you might even, as Jesus says here, have people who kill you like they did him. But even if that's the case, you'll have the courage, you'll have the spine, you'll have the backbone, you'll have the toughness to stand for what's true, to hold fast to what the scriptures say, and to honor God even in the face of opposition. Listen, this is a game changer. This is a life changer. And I'm not there yet, but I'm on my way, and I hope you'll come with me. God is glorious, so we don't need to fear others. Pray with me. Father in heaven, thank you for Jesus. In all of his glory and his holiness, in his purity, in his wrath, in his love and his goodness. Lord, would the things of earth and the opinions of man grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Help us to see Jesus. Pray in his name. Amen.